right. All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get going here. And my name is Ryan Fennell. Yeah, hey, yeah, some of you guys know me, like two people. Yeah, so I've been in InfoSec now for a few years and work for Walmart. So I'm super glad to be here and help. I'm also one of the co-founders here. I should say that. Wow, my brain's all over the place because we're trying to keep this thing going. I'm really excited to present our next speaker. I know him pretty well, and he has been a mentor and a friend, and I feel like he's a leader in the Fort Wayne area and is promoting cybersecurity. TJ is currently serves as the information security officer for a financial institution here in the Fort Wayne area and in Indiana, and is responsible for information security strategy and its execution across the organization, including digital and paper assets. So hopefully you can look at a little bit more on his bio on the online, but also TJ has been a friend and a mentor in this community, so I'm very excited to present him. And if you guys give a good applause for TJ Patterson.
Thanks, Ryan. Is this thing? Oh, it is on. So I can't stand still. It's really hard. So we're going to move around a little bit. I brought a couple things here. Had a couple of thank you cards. I had two friends I wanted to recognize, Alice and Bob. Does anybody else know Alice and Bob? See, we got one down here. Alice and Bob, if you're unfamiliar, Alice and Bob have taught us a lot about the PKI infrastructure. They've taught us a lot about cybersecurity. If you're going through certifications, you're going to see a lot about Alice and Bob, and I'm sure you'll continue to see more until they change and they hire some new folks. They weren't able to show up today, so I'm going to go ahead and drop these cards in this mailbox here. This seems a little risky putting things in there that I don't want to have taken, but we're going to let someone from the mail company, USPS or somebody else, come pick that up. And actually, if you're in the room over the next 40 minutes or so, however long that's supposed to be, I hope I timed it right. I do want two people to walk up there at any given point, go take the card out of there for Alice and Bob, go steal that card. I'm encouraging you to do theft. Don't do that in real world. And whatever's in the card, you keep. But we look at this mailbox and, there's a vulnerability with it. There's no lock on the mailbox. There's a risk. You get 100 people, however many people are in this room, are seeing something be put in that mailbox. And there's certainly a risk that somebody's just not going to be a nice person. They're going to go steal it. They may get a reward, they may not. They may exploit that vulnerability. But yeah, there can be vulnerabilities in anything. It's not always just technology. And so today we're going to talk about vulnerability management, specifically practical vulnerability. See, we got a taker here. Specifically practical vulnerability management. So to be super clear, I've got a few stories. There may be people in the room that recognize them. So in case there's humor added or you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he told that. In case one of those comes out, just know there's an educational story behind it. We got another taker here. And opinions are my own. I'm not sponsored, so things I say may be influenced in the organization I work for, but just know these are kind of TJ opinions, so if this doesn't align with official rules or anything, that's just what it is. So as Ryan mentioned, I'm the information security officer at Star Bank. There's a few random bullet points. I won't talk about myself a bunch. Some things I do, vulnerability management. Specifically, I'm not in the weeds day to day. That person's actually sitting over here. Sorry, Carson. But I'm not in the weeds day to day, but I'm more involved in the program, policies, all the sometimes less exciting things, just to be realistic. I am curious about you all, though. Anybody in here know nothing about vulnerability management? Like you just walked in off the street? Oh, this is awesome. Like this. No, you know a few things maybe. So no, this is good. I'm just kind of curious. Is anybody here maybe in more of a leadership function, not really technical? Okay, so we got a few folks. And then how many of you are more in the technical space? Maybe you deal with this stuff day to day. Okay, so that's the majority. That's helpful. And then there's a few that don't fall into that. I have no idea where you fit, but that's okay. So marketing. Oh, well, so there's marketing in here too. So early in my career, this is kind of my intro to cyber. You get out of college, you learn all these cool things. You learn how to hack, Red Team. I think the cyber defense team, Indiana Tech, I saw some folks around here from there. It's like you learn all these cool things, and then you get in the real world, and it's like, how do I use this? And so in an organization I worked for, if anybody remembers the Conficker, the April Fool's worm, all that stuff, at that time, there's a lot of different malware and things being publicized in the media. And the organization I was at the time did experience some really bad things. And all I remember is a boss coming in saying, TJ, we got to get this thing under control. Our antivirus doesn't work. The tools aren't doing their job. What do we do? So as a new college student, relatively fresh out of college, I thought, let's go make group policy changes. Hey, sysadmin, I know how to fix this. Give me access to all the things. And apparently that was frowned upon. So I said, that's okay. We have a tool on all the computers anyway. I'll write my own scripts. I don't need you for that. Don't ever do that. So if you're coming out of college, high school, whatever, I strongly recommend against going around when your managers or leaders say don't do something. There's probably a reason. Fortunately, this worked out well, but I was really excited. I got to build these scripts, whole semantics tool, whatever it was at the time, put it all together, and I was able to help remove this thing. Then I had a cool story to tell in 2023. So then a few years later, I'm working with a different organization, and a phone call comes in, and they said, hey, we were given your name. We'd love to talk with you. We just went in and we took all this equipment from this company. I'm like, well, that's not good. And so they said, we'd like to talk with you. Your organization supports this company. We'd like to talk with you about their security. We'd like to talk with you about backups. So I asked around. Nobody told me don't do it. So what do? You want to help people. So I go down to this law enforcement facility. Guy shoves a badge in my face. I mean, it was like Hollywood movies. He says, I'm so-and-so. I'm with the United States Secret Service. And again, I'm thinking, this is awesome. I couldn't get into all these three-letter agencies early in my career, so I just stayed in the private sector. And so I'm all excited about it. And he says, this is our forensic analyst with this cyber team, whatever. And so I shared for the next 40 minutes everything I knew about this company. And I tell the story when I get back, how awesome it was. And apparently legal teams do not like that. That is a bad thing. And so early in my career, whether it was not doing what I was told to do or not do, or whether it was doing something, talking to law enforcement without subpoenas, all that, I learned a few hard lessons there. And then I was told, don't ever do that again. And ever since then, anytime I've dealt with stuff like this, the business cares about things like this. So the point I'm trying to drive home is vulnerability management, whatever the case is, businesses care about different things. The different stakeholders, different people in these organizations care about different things. Technologists want to help people. They want to help stop the bad guys, but businesses have risks to manage. And so I always had to throw something else in there. So la idioma, it's Spanish for the language. And so again, vulnerabilities, business owners, stakeholders, they want to know, are we exposed? Our auditors are concerned. They said we're at risk. Are we really at risk? Where they want to know, why do we have all these hundreds of vulnerabilities? As technologists, you look at your scan report from your tool and you think, oh my gosh, there's red everywhere. This isn't reasonable. Why can't business owners just hire more people? We don't have enough people to solve this problem. And it's just a big pain. And it seems like it boils down to just different language, which is true. So 3 key objectives today. 1, idea generation. For those of you who might be in one-person IT shops, this applies in different ways. There are some folks in here I know that are with larger groups, dedicated security teams, dedicated IT teams. Think about some of these ideas and take them and apply them in a way that makes sense. We're going to bridge the gap between some of the different audiences involved with vulnerability management and then provide tools for effective and, my favorite, is the efficient risk reduction. So to jump in it, you talk to sales folks from these different groups, a lot of great people out there, and you hear things like Gartner Magic Quadrant. We're on this corner of the quadrant. That's why you should buy us. Maybe your boss says, this is in Gartner. Shouldn't we buy this tool? You have vendors that say we do automated remediation. The day that there's AI and all this fun stuff that truly fix all the vulnerabilities, that's going to be incredible. But I just don't think we're there yet. Next gen, it might be an older term, but that certainly floats around on all the different technologies. And then automated patching is another piece, which I think is really helpful. And then you have all these decisions you have to make on how you're going to implement the tool or the thing. And we're not going to dive into all these, but there's just a lot of decisions to make when determining how you're going to implement vulnerability management tooling. So it's critical in your organization to have a vulnerability management program. And there may be other bullet points, but I just want to touch on 5 keys I think that are important. 1 is a purpose. Why are you doing a vulnerability management program? So I was talking to somebody this morning, I don't remember who it was, and they told a story about, months ago, someone said, yeah, I don't remember why we did this, we had to change it. And it seems like a few years after you implement this thing, everybody's looking back to say, oh, why did we do that? Well, when you have a piece of paper or something written out, it's very helpful to refer back to. And then there's a few other key points here that we'll dig into. And so the purpose of vulnerability management maybe slightly different for your organization, but for this example, we're not talking about mailboxes. We're going to talk about just information technology vulnerabilities. So you lay that out and you say, this is why we need to do vulnerability management. This is what we're achieving in the business by doing this thing over here with all these scanning tools, by finding all these threats, all these different things. And you have that laid out on paper so that when you are making decisions later on about this vulnerability, that vulnerability, and you run into a point that you can't decide on, go back to this thing and figure out what is the goal you're trying to accomplish with vulnerability management. Risk definitions are important. There's a lot of words up here. I don't like lots of words or all the vocabulary, but you have critical all the way down to informational. It's important to define what these risks are. Maybe for your organization, you need to know that it's going to cost 10 grand if something happens. If that risk, if that mailbox is exploited, and you know $100,000 checks go in there to be mailed out, well, that could be a $100,000 risk if that lock isn't put on or whatever the circumstance is. It's hard sometimes, I think, to quantify risks, and we'll touch on that here in a minute, but you need to have laid out what are the definitions for your organization. Again, it's for decision points later on as you're working through all the tooling and all the different details. One of the, I put the arbitrary word traditional in there, but a lot of folks, you do your scanning. If you have the Rapid7s, the Tenables, Greenbones, OpenVOS, there's a million different products out there. A lot of them, most of them will say, hey, here's a vulnerability. It's, they'll pull from, NIST and the vulnerability, the CVEs, and they'll say this is a critical vulnerability. It's rated at a 10 on that CVSS scale. And so as an organization, you might adopt it and say, all right, we found 30 different criticals. So these are going to be critical for us, and therefore they're potential for this high dollar impact to our organization. Maybe that's what you use. Personally, I like this practical risk approach, which is in a lot of different books. It's just general risk management, the likelihood that something's going to happen. So I literally just told all of you to two people to come up and take the thing out. So the likelihood is pretty high that somebody's going to go up there and take that. And the impact, well, I don't know the impact. Somebody else will have to tell me what was in those cards. But the idea is you come up with a likelihood, you come up with an impact, and this can get a little challenging when you actually practically apply this, which we'll touch on here in a minute, that as well. But you've got to have a way to calculate that risk and quantify it. And so this is just a model that you can use. Asset criticality is another piece. I can't count on my hands how many times I've seen organizations through the years, ones I've worked for, different ones I've done support for, where nobody knows what's there. Nobody knows that there's the PLC for that line, that if it goes down, your manufacturing is going to come to a complete halt. Nobody realizes that PLC is not segmented. Or in the banking world, you have ATMs. Nobody realizes that ATMs are not segmented, or there's a weak control. Whatever the case is, you've got to know what you have, and you have to be able to classify those. These are just examples in just a little bit of context. So the critical, for instance, what I mean by perimeter or publicly exposed, say you've got Exchange in-house. You have at least 2 or 3, maybe 4 ports that are going to be open to the internet, which is okay. As B.B. King talked earlier, he mentioned web application firewalls. You may have stuff like that protecting those assets, but the reality is controls are a little less. They're exposed to the world. You might want to consider those critical. You might want to consider your domain joined systems as a high or a much higher criticality, because the reality is if a domain controller does get compromised, chances are they have privileged access already. I mean, they kind of do. And when it gets to the world of ransomware, that's just bad news. So you've got to be able to classify these. You've got to be able to risk rate the vulnerabilities and make sure that it aligns well with your organization and its purpose for the program. Another big one is service level agreements. This is my favorite. Actually, I can't stand it, but you've got to be able to tell stakeholders. So for technologists, it seems like the majority of this room is technologist focused. So you've got to be able to tell the business, look, if we as a subject matter expert say that this vulnerability is critical, you're still, watch my wording here, you're still in control, right? You're the expert. The business leans on that. If you have said to the business, we're going to fix this thing in 48 hours, well, you better fix it in 48. And that's a way for you to communicate with stakeholders to give them confidence in what you're doing. It's a little bit of a confidence piece. There's some other elements to it. If you've said there's a high vulnerability, well, it should be fixed in 5 business days, and so on and so forth. But I think it's up to you at the organization. You've got to figure out what that SLA looks like for you. One that I love, a lot of times with outsourced partners, they do service level objectives, meaning agreement, you're required to, you may have to pay fines if you don't hold to it, or the objective looks cool on paper and then they just dance around all the paper. You can do that too. That's not recommended, but it works. And then you have exception tracking. This can be a little bit of a pain point, but the reality is you as a subject matter expert, if you're in a technical role, have told the organization, this thing is critical. You as that subject matter expert have said, I accept the risk. You better be able to show the organization that risk you've accepted, help them understand it. And there's an approach to document those. When it comes to SLA breaches, let's pick on Microsoft, just easy example, sorry. But Microsoft, Google, whoever the big players are, they'll say, look at this 0 day, or somebody will announce a 0 day in the news. And the reality is, are you going to patch 2,000 computers or even 50 in a matter of 2 business days? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you're a one-person IT shop and your boss said, get this thing done, and you have no choice. Well, you can put these exceptions in and know that, 3 weeks later, we're going to fix it. But as a business, we have to accept that risk. And so that's an approach to use the exceptions for. So I know there's a few folks in here, maybe not so much on the technical side, but often when you get into vulnerability management, big things that come up are OS patches. I know there's at least 1 or 2 people in the room. One recently was working on a vulnerability. So there's a system that wasn't getting patched. He spends like an hour and a half, 2 hours on this thing. Well, multiply 5 of those every week, those hours start adding up. And I don't know a single person, apologies if you do, that's okay. I don't know a single person that wanted to get in this business to patch computers. But the reality is OS patches are often a thing. The 0 days, public media announcements, they're not going to show up in your tools, but you need to be paying attention to the media. I think sometimes the portrayal is a little bit off and it might be blown up a little bigger than it needs to be, but you've got to pay attention to the Log4j's, to the 0 days with Internet Explorer, or I guess Edge now, et cetera. A lot of times you'll see legacy protocols, old TLS versions, things like that, that a project was done, the solution was implemented and hardened, but over time, said system, these protocols are still where they were several years ago, and your vulnerability tools will start finding those. And then ad hoc misconfigurations. Seems like anytime I've worked with any type of vulnerability management, you can always find UPSs, or surveillance systems are big too. That's kind of scary, but they always use default passwords for some reason. Haven't figured that out. One organization I remember, they probably had 300 or 400 cameras. And when I signed in with what I found on Google, I was a little shocked, but that is a real thing. And for stakeholders, again, those are just things that you often find with these tools. So I threw this visual in here. Again, I'm a visual person. I think when it comes to patching, let's say, so Windows operating systems, whatever the case is, and patching, you've got to look at these as 2 independent things. You have patch management on the left or right, however you want to look at it. You have patch management over here, and you have a program for that. You have SLAs. You have all these things in place that say, you know what? As soon as Microsoft patches come out, we're going to patch within 3 weeks. And so your SLA might be 3 weeks, maybe it's 4, whatever the case is. And then over here on your vulnerability management side, you've got SLAs for remediating and identifying. So you're over here on the vulnerability side, essentially doing checks and balances with your patch management program. And if you're a one-person IT shop, sometimes this concept can be harder to see just because you're the same person doing both things. But this is really what this should look like, in my opinion. So by now, lots of information, lots of words. I'm struggling with all the words, and you're thinking, well, how is this practical to me? So stakeholder reporting, it's always exciting to do. So again, examples. It's about idea generation. So one thing you might consider with stakeholders, if you're on the technical side, are what is the percentage of patches that you've delivered? So you've identified there's a patch that's going to destroy your domain controller and it's going to blow up the network. So you put that over in your exception sheet, but in the meantime, you deploy the rest of those patches. And if 96% of them finish, maybe your target is 96%, maybe it's 97, but now you have something to show, again, confidence to stakeholders that you as a technologist have identified the thing, you're delivering on this thing that you're doing, and here's the percentage. It's an example. Same with endpoints. Percentages might be lower. If you've got a lot of mobile users, maybe your patch management software isn't quite equipped for a mobile workforce, and so it happens to be lower, and you might have to tweak that threshold, or biz systems, essentially, PLCs, your ATMs, things like that, you might consider. Again, this is idea generation. This isn't some perfect formula, but it's a way to articulate to stakeholders. SLA breaches are another one. Again, as a subject matter expert, technologists are identifying these vulnerabilities, telling the business that, hey, this thing is important. Well, then I think it's kind of important that technologists are responsible for that. And part of that responsibility is articulating to stakeholders, hey, we're going to deliver on this thing. And if we screwed up, and I say screwed up loosely, but if we screwed up and we had 2 SLA breaches in March, just explain to the business what happened. Maybe it's a case of so-and-so was out of office that day, we couldn't do it, whatever the circumstance is. At least there's transparency in your ability to deliver remediation on those services or on those vulnerabilities. Another example is in the exception world. I don't think stakeholders need to know every little exception that's made. There's just too many vulnerabilities that are out there. But if you focus on those critical and high, again, you as a subject matter expert have said that here's a critical vulnerability. You've accepted that risk. You need to quantify that somehow and at least show the business what you're accepting, help them understand what you're accepting. And this is just an example way to measure it. You can look at trends over time. This 4, maybe that's that 0 day that was going to destroy your domain controllers, and in April you fixed it. And so that exception goes down. It's just a trend. And then there's operational metrics. So sometimes I look at these as leading indicators. So pick on this example. I've gotten some scrutiny on this example before, but that's okay. So a lot of your tools, let's pick on the Tenables or Rapid7s, these vulnerability assessment scanners, they will sometimes quantify risk. They spit out a number. They say, here's all these vulnerabilities. Here's this number I'm going to spit out on paper. This thing, it's a 50,000 is the risk, or 100,000 is a risk. Well, you've got to figure out what is acceptable in your environment. But let's say you have 100,000 is your risk score, and you go do that, you go look through your tool and you realize, oh, there's 10 assets that are at 100,000 risk for, it seems like all the time. You might decide this is a measurement we want to look at. Stakeholders don't necessarily need to see that, but as a technologist, you're using this to start driving the overall risk down in your organization. I'll button this up a little bit in a second, and I feel like I keep repeating that, but this is just an example metric. No scan, one of my favorites, whether it's vulnerability scanning, EDR agents, whatever the case is, I think it's important to understand where do you not have visibility. So if you don't have, maybe you have 100 computers in your company, and out of the 100, say 10 of them aren't reporting in, you'll never know that. Your vulnerability tool will give you a false sense of security. You're telling your stakeholders how awesome you are. Reality is you're not scanning 20% of your organization, and that's kind of a problem. And so this is an operational metric just to make sure the right data is getting in that system so that when stakeholders see those lagging indicators, they're seeing the successes of the patching, the successes of the different things. This is going to help you make sure those continue to be healthy. Critical assets, just another example. Your public-facing assets, maybe you don't want anything that as an industry standard is defined as critical. Maybe you don't want those exposed on your network. It's just an example of an operational metric. Same with exploit kits. Anybody familiar with the Kali or Metasploit? That's always a fun tool to play with, right? Just don't do it on public networks. I think I heard this morning, don't try that on Sweetwater. Do not do that here. But it's an operational metric. You might look at it and say, well, hey, I want to make sure that if anybody's going to break into our stuff, I want to make sure it's hard. I don't want there to be exploit kits that I can go Google or YouTube to break in. And so it's just a method to reduce vulnerabilities. And then this one's my favorite. I want to draw a little bit more attention to this. So I think there's 2 different components here. In a large organization, you have security teams and you have IT service delivery teams. In smaller institutions, you might be a 2-person, 3-person IT shop, and it's all one and the same. I think it's super important to recognize this pipeline. I don't know if there's a laser pointer on this, but that would be cool if there was. So I think this pipeline, though, your security team is there to identify vulnerabilities. And I'm sure as many know who have done this, those vulnerabilities are going to be identified very quickly. You're going to see lots of numbers run up over here, and it's just not feasible to address them over here on the IT side. That's common in pretty much any business. And I think what's important is security teams, or in the 1-person IT shop, the smaller groups, recognizing the delineation here. You've got, as an IT team, you have to be able to communicate effectively to the security group. You've got to be able to say, hey, security team, we know this is important to the organization. We recognize that. But here's our capacity. And in order for us to help you the most, you've got to help prioritize. And instead of what I think happens a lot is security teams or tools firing over all these things to fix, this team over here has got to sit back and say, all right, here's the 5 key vulnerabilities. That's all we can work on. We know the IT team can't do more. Maybe it's 10, whatever the number is. Feed that small number over to the IT team. Let them fix it. Because what's going to happen is over time, IT team is going to get tired of fixing patching and realize there's a patch management problem, and they've got to go fix the tool. And over time, teams are going to get better at working together, which means instead of 5 labor hours every week to fix this thing, it's only going to be 30 seconds. So I'm exaggerating, but maybe a half an hour. And then once you're able to deliver more, the security team can feed more data. And it's all about that pipeline. And it's all about communication between the teams. So security teams have to recognize that IT teams only have a certain capacity. And if you think that you're going to fix every vulnerability in the environment, you're crazy. It's not going to happen. It just won't. It's not realistic. And that way, when new vulnerabilities come out, the 0 days, the whatever, security teams can say, wait, last week we planned on giving you this vulnerability, but you know what? This popped up in the news. We have to do this first. It helps control that pipeline. And again, make sure that prioritization works effectively. And so an in-practice example, I have a fun picture on the next one. It's not really fun. It's kind of boring, but the example being, you look at your tool output. So you're a security analyst, you're a security whatever on the technology side. You look at that tool and it says, here's my metrics. Here are the things I need to focus on. Focus on the 5, focus on the 10, and get your SLA started. And then address those vulnerabilities. Again, kind of like that pipeline, this is more catered towards a kind of a single person or a small group in an organization, but run through this over and over. It seems a little very elementary, rudimentary, but this process does work. And it works for, if you're in like leadership management roles, I think a lot of times teams, I think, struggle with prioritization in general. It's not just security. And so by feeding little bits and little bits, over time, your teams will perform faster and you'll get high output out of teams. I've personally seen one occasion where a team was struggling to keep up with load, and it was something ridiculous. It was hard to quantify, but I consider it 10x the work. I mean, it was unbelievable the stuff they were able to do. That team then believed, oh my gosh, I can actually do this. And it just reduces friction between security and IT or whatever teams are involved. And so there's the not so cool dashboard, but it's just a practical example. We have one asset that's over 50,000 risk. Maybe that's the target we set out to do. And over time, these all should be 0. But maybe they start increasing. And then you have to either adjust your metrics or you have to get better at fixing vulnerabilities. But it's just an example. It's just an idea. So at the end, your technologists realize, hey, we stopped the threats. We look good. If you're a regulated industry, your auditors come in. There's no juicy findings. Oh, shoot. I almost fell. There's no juicy findings. That was a risk right there. We need to patch that. So there's no juicy findings. And then executives sit back and realize there's minimal risks. So the most important thing today is technologists need to recognize vulnerability management is about risk management. That's what the business cares about. And communication, which is point number 2, is vital. It's not always a technology problem. It's a risk management problem. So if you're a technologist in the room and you're not familiar with terms like preventative controls, compensating controls, you should go Google those and get familiar. It is vital to be able to say those things to your stakeholders or your boss or whatever the circumstance is. And if you're not in a technology position, I would strongly encourage you that if your technologists are saying, hey, we have all this red, I don't know what to do, help equip them to communicate. I think that's a key piece too that I think sometimes is missing as technologists. What they really want to do is help solve problems. I wanted to help the FBI. Apparently that was a risk, bad idea. I think I even heard this morning in the keynote some stuff similar to that circumstance. But it's critical to be able to do that communication. So equip your teams on how to communicate and how to translate the dollars or whatever's most important to the business. And then lastly, use your tools. There's lots of them out there. Doesn't have to be, $20,000 vulnerability assessment tools. It can be Excel, it can be Power BI, it can be whatever you need, but use your tools because it will make your job a lot easier. And that is what we have today in terms of practical vulnerability management. Thank you. Any questions? Nobody told me I was supposed to ask that. Yep. I think that's a terrible idea. It'll scare everybody. So the thought process there, and a little bit of framing, however you want to slice it, but my opinion, TJ opinion, is you have the SLA that starts when you assign the work. So in your program, you've written down that we assign the work here, SLA starts. When regulators, whoever's coming in to look at what you're doing, hey, this is how we do it. As long as you're in alignment with those standards, you'll make auditors and examiners happy, but you'll also start that timer, and it's crystal clear to everybody because it was written in that program. Yeah, so I think if you have the vulnerability assessment tools, that's the I guess the example I'm thinking of. I think you can lean on some of the CVSS scores. I think sometimes you have to lean on some of the IT side of it. Um, SNMP is an example. I think SNMP being public, the community name being public, I want to say it's rated as a high on the CVSS score. My opinion, maybe not so much. Thought process being, what is it that thing is going to, what problem is that going to cause for the business? What risk? They're going to find out the temperature in a server room. That might be a big deal, but in the grand scheme of things, is it? And so as a program, you kind of have to assess what that's going to do to your business. I don't know if I've really answered that well. Does that kind of make sense? I mean, I don't mean to Google. So like, I'm trying to watch my wording, right? No, I think Google is helpful. I mean, you can go in and you can say SNMP or whatever vulnerability, and you might read a bunch of people blowing it up. They're saying, look at CNN, look at all these news media. Oh my gosh, it's Log4j. Well, if your system isn't exposed to the internet, forget Log4j example, but others, if it didn't expose the internet, maybe for you it's not a risk, and you've read enough that that's the case. I mean, that's if you don't have the tools to be able to do this. I think that's one avenue. Mm-hmm. So agents, agents sitting on assets. So that doesn't cover it all. So if you have say 1,000 assets, you have the SCCMs or whatever product to push out your tools, group policies, a policy that enforces some form of inventory agent. Maybe it's ones I've seen are like the vulnerability scanning agents that are dedicated to that, or like I think CrowdStrike does it. There's some different groups that do EDRs, making sure that those agents are there because you're going to get the most accurate inventory from that. Part two of that is having credentialed scans specifically. I mean, opinion here, I don't think your vulnerability scanner is necessarily designed to always find the things that you don't know about. I mean, you may find little IoT devices or the shadow IT device, but if that device shows up and then disappears within a day, you may not see it. And so in those cases, I've leaned more on your other controls like the NACs, which cost-wise, those aren't necessarily always affordable. But I've seen zeroing in on what are the critical assets. Do I care that a TV? So TVs might be an example. Somebody has a TV, they're displaying a big message. I think the risk there is if it's displaying something very publicly, you don't want somebody putting a really bad picture on there. And so that would be something you want to watch. But if there's a bunch of TVs that you don't, maybe they pop up here and there. I think to go back to your question, though, it's more about credentialed scans. It's the asset or the agents on the assets, et cetera, and prioritizing those over the unknown. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And kind of to piggyback on that real quick, there was an organization recently I saw an assessment done where, I'll just pick on Cisco, big name, where an organization was thought to have high risk. They have all these vulnerabilities on these Cisco switches. Well, the reality was they may have this code of firmware that has all these vulnerabilities, but they don't have a wireless controller embedded in whatever the chassis was at the time. They don't have, they have access control lists, which are the compensating control to keep someone on the perimeter from accessing this SSH vulnerability. So do they really have those vulnerabilities out there or not? And that's, I think, to your point, yeah, you've got to communicate that effectively to your stakeholders. Yeah. Mhm. So like two things come to mind. I say it like it's super easy all the time, but relationships with those between the teams, but having say a cadence call. So I know one of the things we do in our organization is a cadence call between several resources, some who don't do any of the assessing, but they do the remediation. And so on that call live, everyone can say, oh yeah, this is just a false positive case closed. And I think over time, when you have some of those relationships cross teams, that can help tackle some of the bigger problems. I know I'm kind of brushing through that. I think we're at the time. Nobody's standing up saying that. Did that kind of help? And I'm happy to chat more too offline if you'd like. Cool. Well, thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.